What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of JaAR. JaAR, for those of you that may be new, stands for Joe
and Amy
Review, and you would be forgiven for being new because it has been a while since we have made this
Yes.
series, or an episode in this series. But this episode in particular, as you can see from the title down below, is part 2 of our review of, come on, War of the Spark Ravnica Forsaken by Greg Weisman. We reviewed part 1 weeks ago, and I'm sure that I will have that for all of you at the end of this video. So if you missed it, you can go watch that part first or after, to be honest. I don't know that we will be referencing back to it often. We may, in fact, repeat some points, so I apologize for that if you are a stickler for those kinds of things. But yeah, this is part 2. The book is actually nicely separated into Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, or Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. So we're reviewing Act 2, or Part 2 here, which I believe was called Hunters. And there is no quick review because this is a full book, first of all, so I'm not going to tell you to just read Part 2, although I will say that I think that I enjoyed this part more than Part 1.
I would agree with that.
And we can...
Again, it has been a while, so...
Fair, but I think we can get into the specifics of why or how. Okay. But yeah, I would say that this part was better, in my opinion, than part 1. Kind of bookending this part, and it really stretched it out a lot. I mean, considering, as you saw at the front cover of that book, that Liliana is very prominently featured in the art, she was mostly absent from this portion of the story. She was present at the beginning of part 2 and barely at the end of part 2. It was mostly, since it was titled Hunters, it was mostly about the 3 assassins or people tasked with assassination tasks to go after Tezzeret, Dovin, and Liliana, and all the things that they did to get to those places. So with that being said, the first thing that we wanted to talk about that I have written here is the whole thing with Liliana at this point, by the time we're done, is that it's all very confusing because Liliana has gone back to Dominaria and she has ended up at her homestead, the Vess Manor, which is supposed to be in ruins, the ruins of the Vess Manor. And it's not in ruins. And in fact, there are servants and there's a big party going on, and the mistress of the house, Liliana Vess, is throwing a big party. But the Liliana that we are following, or that is the subject of the chapter when we originally find out about that in the beginning of this section, is not the Liliana Vess that they are referring to, who is the mistress of the house, who has called for this party. And I guess spoilers, but then at the end of this, we see a Liliana who is a servant working in the garden or something in the back, which is how this part ends. So as I said, it kind of bookends the whole thing at the beginning and at the end of this part. But the part that I wanted to talk about, the thing that I wanted to talk about with this, is that at the beginning part, where Liliana is the focus of the chapter, and we're hearing about this alternate Liliana Vess who is in charge of the manor, they use her full name consistently. And I was doing it too right now, somewhat on purpose, but it was Liliana Vess. Well, every time we've heard about Liliana, it's been just Liliana.
Or Lily. Or
Mistress Vess, or Ms. Ravenhair, or whatever. Like, that's just how the characters refer to her. But we get to this chapter, and everyone, including herself, is referencing Liliana Vess. And when Liliana is referring to Liliana Vess, she's referring to this unknown, like, doppelganger or alternate reality version of herself, or whatever the mystery is of how there is a second Liliana Vess. But when the servants meet up with her, the subject of this chapter, they're calling her Liliana Vess as well. And then when Liliana is referring to herself to the servants, she's referring to herself as Liliana Vess. So I can understand the idea of wanting to have a proper, like, mystery with what's going on. Why is there a second Liliana?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you can't use, like, little tricks of storytelling or writing when distinguishing between the two of them for your reader's sake.
Right.
Just because Liliana and the servants are confused about who Liliana Vess is, if Liliana is right in front of them, doesn't mean that you can't refer to the character that we know and are following as just Liliana,
Right.
and the mistress of the House of Vess as Liliana Vess. It's not that hard. And it would make more sense for us as the reader just to distinguish between who you're referencing at any given time, because that's not taking away from the mystery at all, unless you're really trying to say that this Liliana and Liliana Vess are literally the same person, and she just doesn't have the memory of when she goes to the manor and is lording over these servants, which does not make any sense at all. Because we're following Liliana from the moment that she planeswalks until the moment that she finds out that this other Liliana Vess exists. So
It almost to me feels like an editing mistake. Like that it was originally written that way with a distinction between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And then whoever was editing it
also got confused.
Got confused and thought that there was only supposed to be one and turned it into there only being one.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's possible. It's just confusing. And again, in my opinion, of course, because that's really all that this is, again, if you are new, I'm not saying that this is the gospel, and I would love to hear any and all thoughts comparing and contrasting our own at any given time in the comments down below. But it's just confusing, and it's not the type of confusing like a mystery is confusing.
Right. It's not the type of thing like you're sitting there going, like we need to figure this out.
Right.
Use the information that we're given to, formulate these clues and figure out what's happening here.
Right.
It's really just repetitive, annoying, and confusing.
Well, and having to reread paragraphs over and over again because you're like, wait, which Liliana Vess?
Which one they're talking about?
Which Liliana Vess is this Liliana Vess? Is it the one that they're talking to right now, or are they talking about the one in the manor? And like, it just didn't make a whole ton of sense.
Okay.
Then we can reference the characterization of Liliana very briefly because again, she doesn't really show up a lot in this section, but she is there. And this still talks about, and we'll talk about Vraska in a second as well, but this section still references the bad person that Liliana used to be. Mm-hmm. And again, if you're new here, not that I do not, but Amy has very strong feelings on it as well, rightfully so, that just saying that she's not bad anymore doesn't mean that she's not bad anymore. That's not how it works, and yet that assumption is just being thrown at you from the beginning. And again, the reason I brought it up, the same thing happens with Vraska. Vraska, when we're on her chapters, they bring up her tragic past a lot. And they just kind of throw that at you,
right.
List off her tragic past, and then tell you about how depressed and affected she is by that, and that's the end of the discussion.
Right.
As if that is the end of the discussion.
Right.
And I wrote here, it really seems like the authors or the storytellers in general are saying, no, really, guys, neither of them are bad anymore. They're both good guys, believe us. And it's like, you could just have proven that with their actions instead of using them as the people that you are retconning consistently and etc. And that kind of, before I talk over you entirely.
Like, they kept on basically comparing the two. Basically saying those things about Vraska as if to say that, like, oh, look, Liliana's the same as Veraska. She's not. Liliana is an abuser. Veraska's an abuse victim. Those are two very different things. So, Veraska could have murdered people, but she is not an abuser.
Right, she's not a user, she's an assassin, and they're very different things, I would argue.
Yeah. Or a queen that felt inclined to kill people who were making it difficult for her to do whatever she needed to do.
Right, well, and
in her kingdom for her people.
Right, well, and I was going to say, right, and it was arguably always in order to protect the Golgari.
Right.
And or in reference to Isperia, right, it was to, in her mind, right a wrong that was done to her, and of course a large element of revenge there as well, in settling that debt, if you will.
Right. And for an abuse victim, there are a lot of wrongs to be righted.
Correct.
For an abuser, there really are no wrongs to be righted, because anything that has happened to them bad in their lives, essentially, is not an excuse for them to be how they are.
Mm-hmm. And it's also...
And them being an abuser doesn't just go away because somebody else who is a good person sacrifices themselves to keep that person alive. An abuser does not appreciate that. An abuser does not understand that. An abuser does not care about that. An abuser wants anyone who is in their life who is a good person to suffer, because it makes them feel good. So a good person sacrificing themselves for an abuser, although it is probably rather frequent, it is not something that an abuser really wants, because they aren't suffering as they die, and once they die, they are no longer a plaything for them.
And it also feels like, you talk about comparisons, it also feels like they're trying to say that what Liliana did to the Jaces of the world, to all of the Gatewatch really, as an abuser, are forgiven and or are comparable to what is happening to her with regard to the Raven Man and the Onaki within the Chain Veil. I would argue that they're not, because the whole time, up until this particular story, Liliana has always had sarcastic quips with which to respond to the Raven Man or the Onaki or whatever. And in this one, only in this story are we seeing where Liliana is like, they're talking to me again, just leave me alone, stop it. Like, you were never that helpless before.
Right.
It's just when the authors want you to feel sorry
like
for
a good
her.
Person.
Right. Well, right, and they want you to feel sorry for her and forgive all of the things that she's done previously. Right. But again, I also brought up retconning, and there was something that you wanted to reference with regards to that in terms of...
Well, but on the same vein that we were on, them trying to say that what she was experiencing with the Onaki and her demons and whatever was comparable to what happened to Veraska. Veraska was helpless in those situations. Liliana brought those things upon herself.
Correct.
Veraska being a Gorgon is not a reason for her to have to be tortured.
Kidnapped, imprisoned,
right.
Whatever.
Liliana is only as tortured as she has made herself, because she is a selfish, abusive person
Right.
who manipulates people and tries to keep herself young
Right.
artificially and all manner of other disgusting things. So, yeah, that's all I'm going to say on that. But the other point
Yes,
is
please.
that at the same time, it also seems like they were kind of throwing out those backstories in an effort to kind of let us know what pieces of their backstory are not being retconned. As if to say, like, okay, these are the things you need to remember about these characters. All those other great memories you have about these characters, or horrible memories you have about these characters, forget all those, because now we're putting you in this box of exactly where we want you to decide these characters are going and who these characters are.
And that those are the only parts of their history to show where they've been.
Right.
You're not going to, like Amy said, you're not going to hear about all those other past moments in any way, shape, or form, because this is the story that we're telling.
Right.
And so deal
we're
with
sticking to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Basically. And it's interesting. I don't know that I fully buy that, but I also wouldn't in any way put it past them.
Oh, I buy that more than 100%.
That's fair.
I buy that 1,000,000%. And you know why? Because they're trying to manipulate our perception of these characters into equating Veraska with Liliana and then putting Liliana above Veraska.
Right. So that
Even though there is absolutely no reason to do that based on the information that we know about these two characters.
Right. So that if and when Jace in any way looks at Liliana favorably ever again, it can then be said, well, of course, because he can see how she and Veraska have similar situations or have had similar situations in their lives. And yet, in terms of Jace's interactions with Veraska and Liliana, they are so drastically different in the way that they were being presented during the Ixalan stories.
Okay.
Since then, those stories have been completely bastardized and gutted to the point where we don't really have any of the meaningful parts of that any longer, which is unfortunate and at the time was surprising, but as Amy says, it is really no longer surprising.
No.
And really should just be expected at this point.
Right. And it's at this point it's very apparent that these things are being done very purposefully. And it's offensive.
Right. And so along that vein, let's skip ahead in my notes to continue along this particular portion of the discussion and talk about Veraska on this plane with Vivian where they come across a child, a young girl. And this part bothered me to no end because they're here tracking Dovin Bond, and Veraska is very aware that based on her appearance, it would be very difficult for her to blend in on any plane that she planeswalks to that either they don't know at all or that they know and that they know that there are no Gorgons there. Because that kind of a look on someone on your plane of existence that you in your mind don't know that there are other planes that exist, to you that would be a monster, a boogeyman, whatever you want to reference it as real world terminology. That'd be terrifying for you to come across something like that. And so Veraska makes sure that her head is covered up, her tentacles are tucked away and hidden, her skin tone is visibly hidden, and she comes across a child, she and Vivian. And Veraska's first instinct, rightfully so, based on how she has been treated in the past, is to think, do I turn this kid to stone? Do I draw my sword on her and kill her? Because she's going to yell. She's going to be scared and she's going to yell about me. And it's going to alert other people and our cover's going to be blown and we're not going to be able to do what we're here to do. That is very much appropriately the mindset of an assassin. I need to get in, get out, and be quiet while I do my job.
Right.
And you can't do that if you have a little child screaming about a scary monster with tentacle-y hair or snake hair or whatever you want to call it. Screaming about that and alerting everybody else around so that you either have to leave or kill a ton of people to be able to accomplish your task. And
as opposed to just one person.
And yet, that's not what happens. Now, in an ideal world, in a different medium or a different property, this would be a really awesome moment.
Or done correctly, it could have been a really awesome moment.
Well, we'll talk about it and you know this, but I don't think Magic the Gathering for this story could have ever done this correctly.
Okay.
For this particular story. And I will explain why. But in the proper context, what you're supposed to get out of this interaction with Vraska and this little girl, Vivian is way off on the sidelines at this point and is somewhat irrelevant to this discussion.
Right.
But Vraska goes up to this little girl and touches her to help lift her up off the ground, and the little girl sees Vraska's face and is not afraid. Not only is she not afraid, but she interacts with Vraska, and Vraska picks her up as one would a child, and the child, sees under the hood and gets to, what's the quote? Stroked Vraska's tendrils ever so gently. And again, properly done, it makes perfect sense. Vraska, a person who sees herself as a monster, because that is what she has been conditioned to think about herself based on the life that she has lived, now goes to another plane where she assumes that everyone will consider her to be a monster, and comes across the embodiment of innocence in a child. And that child does not react the way that grown, irrational adults reacted to Vraska, by being afraid of her, locking her up, abusing her, because they were afraid of her and didn't understand her. Feel free to put whatever real-world allegory you would like on that one. But this child is interested in Vraska, is loving towards Vraska, is gentle, and caresses her and touches her in a loving way. And that is where that would end if this were not this story, and if it were not Vraska as a character.
Right.
Vraska's character from Ixalan, prior to any retcons of any kind, because, God, I believe that this is another effect of an attempt at a retcon.
Right.
Vraska only became comfortable with Jace touching her ever so slightly. And then when this story and its prequel came around, then they were kissing and they were having sex and doing all these other things, which, okay. I don't love it because that's a big jump to make, but okay. They were in a life and death situation. There are a lot of ways that you can get around that. But that's those two and those two alone.
And they were in a relationship where they were in a relationship for a while and had a lot of vulnerable exchanges that were lengthy. And had literally experienced one another's thoughts and pasts together. So their connection is such that it can make sense. Right.
That they are interacting physically in any capacity.
Right.
But Vraska doesn't like to be touched. It's made very clear about that in the Ixalan stories. And it takes her, again, quite some time to trust Jace's touch, even when they start getting closer and she becomes more trusting of his amnesiaed self, basically. And yet, not only does she pick up this little girl up off the ground, but then, or help her stand, but then fully lifts her in the air and allows this girl to stroke her tendrils on her head. I don't buy it.
No.
At all. That is, excuse me, especially from someone who moments before she was literally debating murdering out of fear of the girl's reaction towards her. I don't think that someone with that kind of a past, and thankfully for me, I don't have any reference for that, so maybe I'm backwards on that, but my thought on reading this is that Vraska as a character would absolutely not be able to go from, I need to kill this child who's gonna rat on me or whatever you want to say and be afraid of me, to not only am I going to touch her hand to pick her up, but I'm going to lift her off the ground and allow her to stroke the tendrils on my head gently. I don't buy it.
No.
And last but certainly not least, and I will approach this as gently as I possibly can, but I will say that if you want to skip ahead a few minutes, I don't blame you. I am aware, Amy is aware, and I would hope that you are all aware, but I'm sorry if you are all aware, of the person who works for Wizards of the Coast who helped to produce that book and the things that he produced prior to working at Wizards of the Coast. But I'm sorry. I cannot remove myself from him in the back of my mind while reading these stories, so that when I read the sentence, this little girl, a small young girl, quote, stroked Vraska's tendrils ever so gently, end quote, I cannot get out of my head that that was partially helped to be written by a pervert. And I shouldn't have to think about that when what I would, in an ideal world, argue was written as a genuinely nice thing, right? The principle behind it, as I explained earlier, makes perfect sense and should be a nice, genuine thing. That Vraska is able to see that not everyone considers her to be a monster, and there are still innocent, good people in this world. But ironically, there are not always innocent, good people in our world, and one of them helped write this book.
Right.
And so, for me, I can't read that and only think of the positive spin on it. I cannot do it.
And we can't read it and go, oh, how lovely.
Right. That's a lesson.
We have to think about a pedophile who's in charge of making sure what gets put in and taken out of this book.
Right. And earlier in the book, you had, and I think, again, talking about repeating things, right? In part 1, we talked about the description of Rat taking a shower. She's an underage girl. Now you have this child stroking Vraska's tendrils.
Oh, no, it's okay if an underage girl is showering as long as she's invisible.
Right.
Yeah.
So, again, if you if you think that we're being irrational, we would love to hear from you, because completely honestly, I would love to not feel that way.
We want to be wrong.
Yeah.
But we don't think we are.
No. And if you agree with us, we would love to hear that as well. We would, anything, really, about anything that we're talking about today. That should be the worst thing that we talk about here, so I hope that that's the case and we can move on.
Absolutely.
Because now we can talk about more positive things and or at least some, like, what might be just confusing thoughts and topics. Because God knows I don't want to talk about that nonsense any longer. Okay. Here we have a let's talk about the Wanderer. Because in War of the Spark, and by this I mean the card set, although also the book, we knew very little about the Wanderer.
Yeah.
And a lot of people wanted to know more about the Wanderer. There were people who had a lot of fan theories. Was she Elspeth? Was she Ugin? Was she Emrakul? Who is she? And based on this story, we find out a lot more about her. And I would argue that they're kind of cool things that we learn about her. In that the main thing is that unlike literally every other planeswalker that, to our knowledge, that we have ever come across, she does not have to focus on another plane to planeswalk to that plane.
Right.
She has to focus to not do that. That's objectively cool, in my opinion.
Or the concept of it is cool.
Right. The fact that it takes your entire pretext knowledge of what a planeswalker is and what planeswalking is, and literally flips it on its head, but only for this one person. That her planeswalking is so drastically different from everybody else's that it makes her unique in that way.
Right.
That is a great way to portray a character. It makes you interested in that character, and it gives you something to latch onto with that character.
Or at least it would.
Right. Well, but with it come a lot of inconsistencies. Combined with what I will briefly touch on as the problem that I see with it, because it goes back to Kaya being able to kind of put Rat inside of herself and then planeswalk with her. These are all new things that, to the Vorthos' knowledge, are not things that planeswalkers could ever do before, or were ever things that could have been possible in the world of Magic the Gathering stories before. The Wanderer is a new thing, right? Her abilities are a new thing for the multiverse of Magic. Kaya's ability to take an organic being with her, because she absorbs that being into herself and then planeswalks, and they essentially merge into one being for that period of time, that's a new thing. Combine those two things together, these are a lot of changes being brought to this world of Magic story within a story that many people in the community have been calling for to not exist.
Right.
We are not saying we are necessarily one of those people, or two of those people, and we're not saying that we're not. We are simply here reviewing the book and giving you our perspective on it, one way or the other. But what I will say is it very much seems like this is the trajectory in which we are headed now, is this book going forward.
Right.
So these new rules are being created within this novel that many people don't enjoy, and yet it's so drastically changing the rules of planeswalking as we would understand them, that I find that very interesting in more than one way. I find it interesting because, yes, you have new authors coming in, outside authors as well as the franchise team and the story team within Wizards, who are relatively new to this, kind of wanting to write their own rules for how planeswalking works. That, to me, makes sense. That you would fiddle with the rules a little bit and play with them. Excuse me. I don't mind that. What I do mind is we are now at a point, because we waited so long to do this review, we are now at a point where we know that once again, the company has asked us to be patient with them as they are going through yet another transition, which they're trying to claim is the same transition from Dominaria. That's a whole separate video, and I won't get into it here. But my question is, are these rules still going to apply? So while we're on the subject of rules in general and rules being changed or whatever, it just bothers me because these rules are new. So we don't really know a lot about them or enough about them.
Right.
But and so it raises a lot of questions. And sometimes that's fun because, again, right, the whole idea, and I believe I mentioned this earlier, with the authors liking to play with the rules, right, just understanding planeswalking as a baseline, and then expounding on it in terms of like playing in that space. The Wanderer being an exception to the rule and slightly different, and Kaya being an exception to the rule and slightly different. It means that it's a place for them being the writers in any capacity or storytellers, to play with that world and to play with those rules. But my question is, I was just really confused because there's this situation with the Wanderer where the Wanderer isn't able to figure out whether or not, or I should say we're not able to figure out whether or not what the Wanderer's abilities are in terms of being able to track planeswalkers for a longer period of time than other planeswalkers, that like you can sense when a planeswalker has planeswalked and where they're going so you can follow them, but like after a very short period of time that kind of trail goes away, but the Wanderer can sense that trail for longer. But also when it comes to Tezzeret, the Wanderer can sense that trail for even longer in this particular case because of the fact that Tezzeret has the planar bridge in him, which is malfunctioning and leaking even, so it like leaves more of an ether trail. But then they talk about the fact that Dovin Bond, when Vraska and Vivian lost Dovin's trail, they were going to go back to Ravnica and wait for the Wanderer again. So like that seems to be contradictory to the rules as we understand them, but maybe it's because Vraska and Vivian don't understand them. It's just very confusing to me.
Maybe it's because there's no consistency, because everything that happens is just for convenience sake, not because it actually makes sense.
Right. It's just that because it's a new rule, it's something that I'm like pretty focused on because it seems like something that they would want to get right. You know what I mean? Something to that effect.
There are lots of things that they should want to get right, but there are a few things they do get right.
Right. And going along those lines, when Vraska comes back to Ravnica and is waiting, and eventually figures out, hey, guess what? Dovin is back on Ravnica because he is a strategist and no one would be looking for him on Ravnica because he is the most hated individual on Ravnica. Vraska, in talking about that in her chapter, says, or mentions that he's the most hated being on the planet.
Yeah.
And then returned to the planet.
Right.
Like, she's saying he's the most hated being on the planet, and yet when he left, he then returned back to the planet.
Yeah. Because I remember, like, when you read that specific sentence, at first it, like, didn't register in my head as being weird, because that's, like, a thing that people normally say. And then I was like, wait a minute. They referred to it as a planet. Like, they're not supposed to do that. It's a plane.
Correct. Yeah, and I'm glad that you called it out too, because I like glossed over it. I was like, yeah, sure. And kind of like you said, because it's such a common phrase.
It's like a phrase,
right.
Yeah.
And so
like, when I heard it, it didn't register right away, and then it did register, and then you said it again. And I was like,
it was mentioned
wait
twice,
a minute. Okay, no, they really shouldn't have said it that second time.
Yeah.
Because the first time, like, you could see it as just being, like, an easy mistake or whatever because it's, like, a saying. But the second time, it's like, okay, no, now you really did make a mistake. Can you fix it, please?
Right.
Just,
Yeah, it's very weird. And it genuinely, I read it, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, is this a typo? Because planet and plane is there, you just add a T at the end. Yeah. So like, is it a typo kind of a thing where like you write plane, but it should be, you like instinctively put the T at the end?
To planet.
Well, again, or because, not even that, but because it's a, such a common phrase or turn of phrase, you're just like on autopilot and you're typing and you're just like, yep, planet. You know, most hated creature on the planet, whatever, moving on.
Right, or like the editors didn't realize or whatever.
Or more unfortunately, and the cynic in me thinks this as well as an option. Not necessarily thinks like this is definitely what it is, but it's like the cynic in me, because people are so anti-Greg Weisman. Did he forget that that's not the term that's used in Magic to talk about a place like Ravnica? You don't call it a planet, you call it a plane. And it was mentioned twice in like a paragraph. So again, was it like a slip of the finger to the T button, or was it...
Yeah, but the thing is, like, there should have been at least one other set of eyes that looked at this and went, wait a minute.
Even in the heyday of Magic stories, editing is something that I have always been a huge stickler for.
Too.
Always. And
because it's something that they've always had issues with.
Well, I was going to say, there were times where it was good and there were times where it was very bad. And we've tried to call it out whenever we can, but because the thing I always say, if you're new to the channel, the thing I always talk about is if I'm taken out of the story by how ineffective your editing is, then that's a problem. And whether that's just a blatant typo, whether that's a strong grammatical error, right? Those kinds of things take me out of the story and put me into, oh, right, these are words on a paper, not this is the world that's being created and these are the characters. No, now I'm thinking about the mechanics of you writing this, sitting there in your house typing it or whatever. Right. And with the fact that you have to turn this in, you being the contracted author, obviously in this case Greg Weisman, but that whoever the author is has to turn this back into Wizards and say, here's my finished product, is it good enough? Amy's correct. There absolutely is at least one other set of eyes on this. There was, and maybe there still is, but again, a lot of this nonsense is still up in the air, but there was, after Dominaria, I don't know if consistency is the right word, but like a person hired, continuity, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
A person hired to maintain continuity. So presumably they're reading it over, plus whoever is either Nick Kelman or the equivalent of Nick Kelman now, please God, let it be someone else, who is reading over it and approving it, like, there should be another set of eyes. And again, it's possible...
And the continuity person of all people should have gotten that one.
Correct.
Because that's not a normal typo. That's a continuity issue.
Correct.
Because you would not refer to it as a plane in the Magic universe.
A planet.
A planet. In the Magic universe, you would refer to it as a plane.
And again, that's a fair... The mix-up that you just did, you're welcome. No, but that's the point, right? It is an easy mistake to make.
Yes, and we're not saying it's not.
No,
so
and
the benefit of the doubt, we're trying to give.
Right. It's just that is, it's so weird because that is a big one, I think. Yeah. And again, Amy caught it and I didn't. So props more so to Amy than to me, the fact that we're even talking about it at all. But
and that's the thing, like the person who caught the mistake shouldn't be given props. The person who fixes the mistake or doesn't make it in the first place are the people who should be given props.
Well, but that's my point behind all of it. If this was the worst error that they made in the whole book, then we'd be sitting here going, we noticed that it said planet and not plane, and then like you could say like, all right guys, really relax. But it's just compounded on top of
everything else.
The character deficiencies and things like that, where to Vorthos, it really just seems like it's like a shameless cash grab as opposed to people who genuinely care about the story like you used to have. And so I sometimes get irked by people who are like, just go back to having in-house authors. Like, sometimes that bothers me because it's like, but they're all gone. They've all moved on to doing other things. And it was for a reason. The company doesn't want to pay 6 or 7 people full-time salaries and benefits because they're a company and they like making money, and whatever your opinions are about that are your opinions about that. And that's fine either way. But the thing that bothers me about it is that the people that they had writing the stories were people who were passionate about the stories, not people who were there to try to form some kind of contractual symbiotic relationship where the Magic fans and the fans of this established author can bridge and switch so that hopefully the author is now getting Magic fans to start reading their stuff, and Magic fans are getting fans of that author to read their stuff, because that's 100% the reason why they did it.
Right.
In my mind, that's not a question. I'm willing to be proven wrong as always, but there's nothing that I can imagine for any other reason besides the two. One is that they can contract that person, not pay them benefits, and not have to worry about paying them a full-time salary. And two, because then Wizards can think to themselves, well, I'm contracting with an established individual who has a fan base, and hopefully that will bring more eyes to our Vorthos product, because when we started on this venture in the first place, we didn't think that our Vorthos product was making us enough money. Trust me, they said it to our faces many times.
Or the community wasn't large enough, and so we didn't matter.
Right, or they weren't spending enough money on the game, or at least it wasn't provable that they were.
Right.
And so this plain planet thing is nitpicky, but it's really
for a reason.
Well, right, because it shows disrespect to the world that you're writing for. Right. They're not called planets here. You should know that.
Right.
And if it's a typo, fine, then it's a typo. That's an honest mistake. But the fact that you as the author didn't catch it, you as the person from Wizards who's approving the story didn't catch it, you as the continuity person who's reading over it didn't catch it, combined
Editors didn't catch it.
If there were any, combined with all of the other issues and complaints around this story, and it's the method of its writing, or the fact that it exists in the way that it does, that's a problem. Yeah. And it just adds on top of it. So
yeah, I mean, kind of going back to what you said before, it's just kind of like a standard issue that companies have, where the quality goes way, way down because they're trying to make it too efficient. They're firing the people who know what they're doing to bring in people who do not know what they're doing, so they don't have to pay them as much.
Yeah.
And then they're not doing the adequate work to make sure that these people do know what they're doing, because that costs too much money and time.
Well, yes, for both sides, for the company and for that author, because
it's you know, that's standard and it sucks.
Yeah.
But there is you know, a way of making yourselves more efficient and doing it right, and this is not a good example of that.
Right. It sucks that the stories were better when you were overworking Alison Lures to write every story for you every week.
Right.
But it's because, one, Alison is a fantastic writer.
Right.
And two, she knew the characters, the setting, and the story inside and out, and was super passionate about it. Right. But when you have...
gave a damn. Right. I mean, it's clear that these people don't actually care about Magic the Gathering. They don't even know anything about it. They're just here for a paycheck. Right.
Well, but that also seems to be the company's MO, right? As content creators, we can say that, you know, when they went to very, very long time, large content creators like Game Grumps and MatPat and etc. to make MTG Arena videos for them. And by the way, we are fans of both Game Grumps and MatPat, so this is not me bad-mouthing them in any way, but this is me calling out the company, as many other people did. This is not an original thing.
No.
But the fact that the company decided to turn around and go to those big-time creators who had never made Magic content before, and frankly, who were just okay at the game to begin with when they played it.
Or didn't, just kind of pulled it out their butts.
Right. That was very clearly... Hey, Magic content creators, obviously the biggest on YouTube would be the Professor, right? Tolarian Community College, I tried to say Professor and then stumbled over my words, I apologize. But Professor / Tolarian Community College, you're not good enough because you don't have enough subscribers. The Game Grumps and Game Theorists do have enough subscribers, so we're going to go to them instead of you, despite the fact that we contract with you all the time. you have an established magic-loving fan base, but we're not going to promote your work. We're going to go outside of that and go to these people who, as Amy said, are just in it for a paycheck. Or they might turn around and say, oh man, Magic was cool however many years ago, and that's when I played it and I loved it.
Yeah, like I think Aaron had played when he was like...
And no, Danny. It was Danny. Or maybe it was both. Oh, but I know it was Danny. He talked about it a long time ago.
It's irrelevant, honestly.
Well, but you could do it in two different ways. They're in California. Find a Magic content creator in California to be there with them to film that episode.
Right.
Do a collaboration, as we're being told all the time is super important to do.
Exactly.
So foster that collaboration with all of this money that you're super willing to throw around, not at anybody who does MTG content besides that one video that you pay them for.
Right, or they're going to sit there and try to say that, like, Jace is the face of the company, or Liliana's the new female face of the company. Ugh. When it should have been Veraska.
Sure seems like that, though.
Why can't you have a YouTube face of the company? Use some business sense. If the person doesn't have the number of subscribers that you want them to have, give them the resources to get them. Back them. Create the face.
And that's obviously this is in no way us saying that it should be us.
No.
God,
we're not saying that.
Please
we definitely do not have what they're looking for in terms of subscribers. If Tolarian Community College doesn't.
Right. But not even that.
But that's not the point. Like, find somebody who actually cares about the game to promote the game.
Right. And I mean, they do a really good job in terms of like somebody like Jimmy Wong, an established actor who creates really great content. And you get him to be in front of the camera with the Mark Rosewaters of the world making the huge announcements for 2020 of like all the sets that are coming out. He's in Mulan coming up soon. Yeah. Congratulations, that's so awesome. Cool. But have him, is he anywhere near California? I actually don't know.
I mean, if he's in Mulan, I would have to assume so.
No, I assume they would fly him out. Because I'm pretty sure I don't know. I would guess he's near Seattle, but I could be wrong. Because a lot of the Magic content creators are in Seattle. Shout out East Coast content creators. Basically us and Saffron Olive. Those are the only ones that I'm aware of.
I'm sure it's much cheaper to fly from Seattle to California than it is from East Coast to California.
Regardless. Well, yeah, but for one video, that's not worth it. Like, but what I'm saying is, like, he's a very good ambassador for your brand. Send him to the big time channels that will know that he is an actor. He was in Video Game High School, which was acted in by many big time YouTubers back in the day. Like,
and other famous people, I feel like, too, that weren't solely YouTubers. Am I correct on that? Or I guess they started out as YouTubers and then became.
Oh yeah, no, you're right. There were actors,
legitimate celebrities.
Sure.
If you don't think YouTubers are, which a lot of people don't.
Right.
But
which is somewhat unfortunate, depending on who you're talking about. We are not celebrities. Again, please remove us from any of this portion of the conversation that we're having. But for the love of God, we appreciate all of you watching us, but in no way are we sitting here like, yeah, we're like big time YouTubers or whatever. No,
don't make me sick.
Yeah, we have to eat later. And the last thing I wanted to talk about before we close out this video is just to go back to a point that we touched on earlier, and I want to expand on it before we end, because I think that this is a positive that is also somewhat a negative because we're talking about this. But the best parts of part 2 of this book, or act 2 or whatever, have always been, or consistently been, the Rat, Kaya, Teo, whatever chapters, right? Jaya was there with them for parts of it as well, and she was great being her snarky self. But all of those moments are the best. They are the best ones that have been in here, and I would argue that they are longer on average than all of the others, as I believe I may have said earlier. But it just shows that it shows, I think, Greg Weisman's abilities pushing through the muck a little bit when you get to those parts of the story. And that's a positive thing, but it's also a negative because it's so weird, right? Again, talking about decisions that the company makes, this whole situation with War of the Spark Forsaken, Greg Weisman came out looking like a chump.
Yeah.
An absolute chump.
Sure did.
And I'm not comfortable jumping on the bandwagon against him yet.
Right.
I'm not comfortable saying he's exonerated, he did nothing wrong.
No.
But I'm not comfortable sitting here going, "Oh my god, he's the shittiest writer I've ever seen. Why would you ever pick him? He sucks. I'll never read anything by him again." I don't know that that is appropriate. Right? And some people have said, you know, he wrote for Gargoyles, a children's television show. So maybe he's only good at writing for children's content. And maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But I look at the big picture, and big picture on this one, the thing that frustrates me is any other author, like big time author that Magic is looking to contract with, like they had Kate Elliott for the Wildered Quest, but they'd worked with her already.
Right.
So if you're trying to go to a new established author who writes sci-fi, fantasy, whatever properties, and you want them to write for your product, for Magic the Gathering, why would any of them do it for you? I wouldn't, because all you have to do is look at the flame war over Greg Weisman.
Yeah.
And I'm not confident, as I said, to throw Greg under the bus wholly on this one, because I think that it also had to do with the people within the company who were managing him, if you will, in writing these stories. And to a degree, he said that as well in his response to the backlash towards this book. He said, like, look, this is what I was asked to write. I wrote it. I'm really sorry. And there are two ways to look at that. He could be clapping back, if you will, if you want to call it that. That's a really crappy way of putting it, but he could be responding in that way because that is actually what happened. Or he could be trying to save face and say, like, no, guys, listen, I don't really suck that much. It was totally the company. Because he's aware of the fact that the company snapping back at him and starting a childish argument over the internet is not a good look for a company that is going to, as I said, be trying to look to other authors to try to work with your product. You don't want, if a flame war starts with your fans and the author, you don't want your company then turning around and being like, yep, it was totally the author's fault. Don't look at us. It was totally them. Then no author is going to want to work with you, and you're blacklisted. So behind closed doors, the company could look at a future author and say, listen, like, he screwed up. We're trying to not make that mistake again. But in public, the company can't do that. They can't save face or whatever. And so I'm not sure which way to go with that. And I guess in that respect, for the company, that's a positive for them being so tight-lipped about a lot of stuff, is that you don't definitively know who is at fault, if that is even a thing, because there's also just the case that it could just be a conglomeration of things, and there is no one person to point at and, you know, and blame, which is not the sexy answer. You want to be able to look and be like, nope, it was obviously what this person did, and so it's clearly their fault, and they should take all the blame, but we can't really do that in this situation because we don't have all the facts. But I will say that these good moments with Kaya and Rat and Teo are good moments. They're enjoyable. They're comedic. Like, they really do seem like, to me, when I read them, the thing I think of is, oh, this seems to be Greg Weisman shining through a little bit. And that makes me lean towards the fact that he was kind of handcuffed by what he was asked to write for. But I think that part 3 will give us a little bit more on that because of the fact that it seems like we're going to be much more heavily Liliana based in part 3. And we were in no way really Liliana based in part 2.
Yeah.
Like I said, she was at the beginning, she was at the end. It was book, a book ending.
Barely even in it.
Right. And so now that we're going into what I assume will be a lot more of established characters like Liliana, Jace, Chandra, Veraska, etc., Rahl, it'll show, I think, whether this part was an anomaly in having such interesting parts in it, or if part 1 was the anomaly, and then we start trending upward in terms of like interesting things to happen in the book.
Okay.
We would love.
Interesting concept, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I'm willing to close it out unless you had anything more to say.
No.
Okay. So what I'll say is we would love.
Enough dead horses at this point.
Well, and we have part 3, so stay tuned for that. You can feel free to subscribe. It'll pop up here at some point towards the end of the video. But for now, thank you all so very much for watching. We would love to hear your opinions, your thoughts, your comments, your concerns, your questions, your admonitions. I don't even know if that's the word. Admonishments. That's the word.
I don't even know what you're trying to say.
Negative comments towards us.
Oh.
Like if you feel like we've said the wrong thing or we went too far.
Please explain to us how you see a different option.
Yeah.
Maybe we're just missing something.
Right, and maybe we're being bitter.
Right.
Absolutely.
Maybe we're just, nitpicking like you said before.
Right. And that's definitely an option, and it's definitely something that we're willing to hear.
Right.
But we would love any and all opinions that you have. We would love to hear them in the comments down below. So
yeah, because they actually really do matter to us.
Oh yeah, big time.
Even if they don't matter to wizards.
Well, and I was going to say, nice one. I was going to say, be kind to your fellow commenters as well, because we are not looking to get into arguments here.
No,
but if you agree or disagree with us or a fellow commenter, let's talk it out. Let's try to.
The discussion's not an argument. The discussion is worth having.
Yeah. So please feel free to do that in the comments. You can check us out on Facebook and Twitter. Those links are in the description as always. Also, we have 2 other channels.
Yes.
We have video games.
Check them out.
Yes, we have Video Games for All and Gluten Free for All. And actually, I said that the subscribe button for this channel would be here. I lied to you. Scroll down for that. The subscribe button for the other 2 channels will be here in the middle. Video Games for All has been going very strong. We are playing through Pokemon Red.
We've got lots of content.
Yes, we're playing through Pokemon Red. Amy's first time ever playing Pokemon Red, or any Pokemon game for that matter.
Yes.
So definitely.
Almost any video game ever.
Yeah, so definitely go check that out, as well as the other series that's going on currently on the channel is Life is Strange. That game is fantastic.
Amazing.
We love it, and we recommend that you go check that one out as well.
Strong content on that, though.
Yeah, I don't think we've gotten to it yet, but it's coming soon. But yes.
No,
so,
I was trying to say, like, it's jarring sometimes.
Yeah, I'm saying I don't think we've gotten to that part in the game yet.
Oh, okay.
But yes, it is coming.
But it gets there.
Yeah, definitely. So be aware of that and keep yourself safe. And we do the appropriate warnings beforehand as we get to that point. But that's neither here nor there. Please feel free to check out those things. Check out the other stuff on this channel as well. We do lots of things. So we would love to have you go check them out if that's something that you all enjoy. But that is going to be the end for now from us here at the Geek for All family of channels. Thank you all so very much for watching this episode of JaAR. I have been Joe.
And I'm Amy.
We haven't done the show in a long time. You have to forgive me. We will be back to you hopefully very soon with part 3, with the Wild Earth Quest, with other things, so that we can continue to come to all of you as we all join together in showing off our...
#Vorthos Pride.
Like I said, I almost forgot it. This has been a long time coming.
Yeah,
but
I was surprised you remembered because I had forgotten it.
Well, good. I'm glad I did then. Thank you all seriously so very much once again. And as we always say, in whichever video of ours you watch next, we will see you all next time. Thanks, everybody.